Welcome to Satsang.
Hello, Vishrant. Can you please talk about the call to enlightenment?
The call to enlightenment. It's a funny subject to talk about because there's a thirst in some people to know the truth. And there's an absence of that thirst in other people. And those who have this thirst are curious. They want to know something that's a little bit different. They want to know something that's beyond their programming, beyond their belief systems, beyond what they've been educated to believe as possibly true. And so, in endeavoring to try to even explain or talk about what the call for truth is, unless you actually have that curiosity, unless you actually are interested, it's probably an impossibility in a lot of ways. I can remember back to when I was a kid, I was interested in God. I was interested in higher consciousness. I was interested in heaven. And I was interested in what hell was, because of course I was brought up as a Roman Catholic. And at some point, when I was in my young teens, I wanted to become a priest or a Roman Catholic brother to teach. So there was always a calling there. There was always this interest in something beyond, something greater than just the mind and its story of itself. In the beginning, there was an awful lot of beliefs that were passed to me. And the curious mind started wondering, well, these are just beliefs. They're not my own direct experience. What's actually real? And it is the doubter in the spiritual seeker that has them seek the truth. And the truth has nothing to do with belief systems. It has to do with your own direct experience of what is actually real. And in seeking what is real, you start having to put all your beliefs in the maybe column. You have to start approaching with a sense of doubt, because it is only in doubt that we can find the truth. If all we have is faith, there's no guarantee whatsoever that what we have faith in, which is a borrowed belief system, that it's real. But in seeking truth, in practicing meditation, in practicing self-inquiry, in practicing openness, we start to get a taste of what is actually real, of what the sages have been talking about for thousands of years. And in that taste of reality, the thirst for truth fires up. And so for me, it was very much in my relationship with Osho Rajneesh, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, when I originally joined him. And I started to find that silence and that stillness and that vastness while in his presence. And I realized that there was another mountain to climb, because I'd climbed the mountain of business, entrepreneurialism, and I'd got basically to the top of my industry, and there was nothing there. It was just, well, you succeed, so what? There's nothing there. And so there's this new mountain that was presented to me, and this mountain was the mountain of higher consciousness, or the mountain towards enlightenment. And attempting to approach that mountain with the same methodologies that worked in business didn't work. Because in business, We get to succeed through totality and through resistance. We get to succeed by standing alone, actually in resistance with totality. In higher consciousness, we get to succeed by standing alone in surrender. It's very different. It's much harder. It's much easier to resist because we're programmed to resist by nature. We're not programmed to surrender. We're not programmed to accept. We're programmed to resist by nature. And so in going for higher consciousness, in going for enlightenment, we're actually going against nature, because nature dictates that we survive, and we survive through resistance. Surrender doesn't support survival at all. And so someone who has woken up, someone who has raised their consciousness levels to that level, has defeated the survival mechanism of their own mind. And this is where the true rebellion comes in. To rebel against your own mind and learn surrender. Take away all the belief systems that don't hold water and just go for your own direct knowing, your own direct experiencing of what is real. That takes a fair bit, because you're left with not knowing which way to go in a lot of cases. And so for me, I was with a spiritual master, Osho, and he pointed the way. And he pointed the way quite clearly. His methodology was witnessing, watching the mind. Instead of being involved in the mind, just be the witness. Just watch, just witness, just watch what's there and keep witnessing. And that witnessing is awareness. And if you keep witnessing, you develop a detachment from the mind itself, and you start finding yourself more and more and more as just the pure awareness of what is happening. And now we're back to reality. Now we're back home. People think that they are the mind. They think they are the body. But no, there's this that's aware of the mind. Before the mind even begins, there's this that's aware, pure consciousness. And this is what we are. And this is always here. And so in fact, we're always at our final destination. But because people are thinking they're the mind and they're believing their mind to be true, what it's thinking, they're lost in a dream. They're not lost in reality. They're lost in a dream and believing the dream to be true. Find what is aware of the mind and become aware of that. Turn awareness back to itself. Turn consciousness back to itself and wake up to what is real, to your true nature. This is where the quest for enlightenment, the thirst for enlightenment, the call takes you to home, to what you really are. But on that journey, you discover that you're not the mind. You can't be the mind, because you start hitting no mind when you're a meditator. And how can you be the mind when you're still here, but the mind's quiet? It's not moving. You're still here and there's silence. And so we're not the mind. Well, what are we really? What is actually here? And what is always here is pure awareness. And so in witnessing the mind, we get to see, first of all, that we're not the mind, but we also get to see through the mind, we get to see the obstacles that the mind creates. And in seeing that we have an obstacle, we can avoid it or change it, alter it, take it away. What we can't see, we can't do anything about. And so insight's quite important. Some people think that insight is the answer and that's the end, but that's not true. Insight is actually an invitation to take it apart if it's in the way, or change it in some way that's better if that's possible. Insight is not the answer by itself. And so the call of this wanting to know self as something greater is an egotistical call in the beginning, but it doesn't end up that way. because the further you go into consciousness, the higher your consciousness becomes, the less you are as an I, the less you are as a something. And ultimately, you find yourself as nothing, vast emptiness, vast, can't be described what we truly are, but it has nothing to do with being a mind and a body. They are just vehicles that beingness or existence or consciousness, whatever you want to call it, gets to witness out here. Before the mind begins, you are. Are there any questions? Are there any statements? Are there any challenges to this teaching today?
Do you think it's a natural evolution to be attracted to truth after a certain number of reincarnations?
Reincarnations. See, as soon as we start talking reincarnations, we're talking about, for a lot of people, a belief system, because they actually don't really remember their past lives. And one of the things I try to avoid is giving anyone a belief system, because from my understanding, all belief systems are in a way traps. We're better off putting all belief systems in the maybe column and finding out through our own direct experience what is real and what is not real. And so rather than actually explore that question and somehow give a lot of people another belief system, I'd rather not.
What exactly does the call to enlightenment look like? Is there only one path?
Oh no, there's plenty of paths. For me, it looked like wanting to become closer to God through and being in service as being a Roman Catholic priest and brother when I was a teenager. I fell in love with Jesus as a child. I fell in love with his beauty, or the beauty that was being portrayed of him. I fell in love with the service that he offered humanity. I thought he was a kind man who somehow was the Son of God. And it fascinated me. It was so interesting. And it led me eventually to India to check out what the Hindus were talking about when they were talking about enlightenment, and what the Buddhists were talking about when they were talking about enlightenment. It took me all over the world to different places, this interest and this thirst in wanting to know who I am really, rather than this thought that I'm a mind and a body. So I started to understand that in silence, we find ourselves, in silence and in stillness. And the way to that is meditation and self-inquiry and witnessing the mind. And so the practice of those things became prevalent in my life, looking to see what was real and what was not real, serving that was real. And so I became a servant of heart because I found that heart was real, love was real. I became a servant. When we're talking about from a mind's perspective right now, my mind became a servant of truth. It became a servant of heart. And in that service, it laid itself down because that's what works. What works is surrender. What works is unconditional surrender. The survival mechanism doesn't survive unconditional surrender. It's like a death. And in that, there's so much freedom. There's no freedom really in scrambling around to survive. And so I went to Murdoch University sometime in the early 90s and studied the old masters at the university, because they've got a great library on spirituality, and reading, studying. I spent about 6 months there studying all the old masters, whether they were Sufi or Buddhist or Hindu or Christian for that matter, or Muslim. And the bottom line is all the ones that were involved in enlightenment all said the same thing. It all boiled down to unconditional surrender. Let go, let go, let go. And so now I understood the answer to every question around spirituality. Let go, let go, let go.
The following question has been written by a viewer. Watching the mind does not seem possible, as when I'm actively watching, there are no thoughts. But when there are thoughts, the one who watches is one with it. How can I see the thoughts separately from the one that watches?
Okay, so that's not my experience at all. If my mind moves, it is witnessed. Most of the time, it just stays still. But if it moves, it is witnessed. And that was a habit that was developed a long time ago, some 30 odd years ago, from watching the mind. Instead of being involved in the story of the mind, being the witness of the mind. And that practice began in meditation of just watching, sitting silently, doing nothing, and just watching. And it took a while. It didn't happen straight away. It took a while. It took a bit of practice, sitting silently, doing nothing, just witnessing. And so my understanding is that if you do that, if you sit silently, do nothing at all, and just witness, you'll find that more and more you are the witness rather than the mind. And then there's this separation. Now, what is witnessing? What is this that's witnessing? That becomes interesting. Before, the mind was interesting, but what was witnessing? What is simply aware of the mind? This becomes more interesting. And what is it about? And so the mind is being used to turn awareness back to itself.
The next question has been written by Mario. Why did our minds evolve from being humans' greatest advantage to our greatest problem?
I can't answer the question. I really don't know. I walk around, and this has been a long time now. I've got to go back 40 odd years, 47 years, because I started to realize when I was 20 that everyone's suffering and everyone was future projecting to avoid suffering or using some other methodology of escapism to avoid suffering. And I had to have a look at, well, why is everybody suffering? And it's because we're desiring things to be different than how they are. Our addictive demand that things change creates our suffering, and our attachment to things that we have and our fear of losing them creates our suffering. So the whole world is suffering. And it took me a while to get that because I had a lot of trouble believing it. The first noble truth, life is dukkha, or dissatisfying. And it was because I was using all these escape methodologies. And I was future projecting that later was going to be better, that everything was going to be okay when I got this, and maybe that. But that was a lie I was telling myself. Because it's only now. What is it like now without using an escape methodology? If you watch your mind, you see how it just constantly wants things to be different. That in itself is a form of resistance, and resistance is suffering. So I changed things. I stopped pursuing in that way. I started to see that the way we thought about the world created a lot of our suffering. Whenever we addictively demand that anything be any way, we create massive resistance in ourselves, and that resistance is suffering, and that we don't actually have to do it. We can accept life as it is. Such is life. This is the way it is. Or we can resist life and fight life and suffer until we die. And I just didn't see the point in doing that. I didn't see the point in suffering at my own hand. And then I was looking at, I think it was a little bit before 20, I was looking at, well, what's victim orientated thinking? How does that come into play? Where I actually start not taking responsibility for my feelings, but blaming situations, other people, and even myself. What happens when I move to that mode is I suffer incredibly by being a victim of circumstance or other people or myself. I went, I don't want to do this either. It's like, this suffering is created by me. Why would I want to be into suffering when I can not do that? And then I started to have a look at worry. And I went, whoa, there's no advantage whatsoever in worrying. None. All you do is create resistance in your mind by procrastinating something you don't want to happen or you do want to happen over and over again. It changes absolutely nothing, kills your clarity, and creates suffering in you. And I was lucky enough to discover these things because I was involved in a higher consciousness group or a personal growth group when I was 19 called Focal. And Focal promoted a book by 𝐸𝐴𝐺𝐻 called The Handbook to Higher Consciousness. And I read it about 20 times because it was just gold. What do you think it's worth to not be a victim to life for 40 odd years? What do you think it's worth to not worry for 40 odd years? Because neither of those things have to happen. We do not have to support worry, and we do not have to support any thought that creates suffering in ourselves. What's your thoughts? Just witness them and see how when you want something to be different, it's a form of resistance, and that resistance is actually a form of dissatisfaction, which is actually suffering. And we don't have to. We can be free of that if we want. If we put our minds to going, no, don't want to play that game anymore. Or you can continue it. And this is one of the advantages of witnessing the mind. You get to see how the mind does all these things. You get to see how the mind creates its own reality with the way it thinks. And because you can see it, you can do something about it. If you can't see it, you can't do anything about it. It's not possible. It's up to you. And so in watching, in just watching, sitting silently, doing nothing, and just watching, if we do it long enough, we start to find ourselves as that is simply aware. Now, we miss it usually in life because it doesn't move and it is silent. And we're always looking, for primal reasons, for something that moves and makes noise. Yet, what we truly are does not move and does not make noise and is always here.
The next question has been written by Banu. Sir, why Osho has given darshan to you and Shashankanand and not his other admirers? Why he's still helping others even after leaving his body?
People look at Osho and they think of him as a person. Osho went way beyond being a person. He was living his beingness, as all awakened ones do. And there is no difference. Beingness is beingness. There aren't two beingnesses. There's one beingness. And so Osho is here. Buddha is here. It's all here. And you are here. We are all one. The teachings are the same, because how can they be different? Just a little westernized. The energy is the same. How can it be different? The Buddha field is the same. How can it be different? We are one. When awareness finds itself, a Buddha field is created. That Buddha field can be tasted anywhere in the world, but it always tastes the same. And the Buddha field, created by someone who's awake, is a doorway for you to find yourself as truth. Osho is here.
The next question is from Dr. Reese. Dear Vishrant, what do we do when the mind becomes fearful and projects vivid thoughts of fear?
Dr. Reese. Imagine it's Kevin. When fear arises, fear itself is a dream. It's not real. It might seem real because you're probably having some kind of physiological reaction, adrenaline being fired into the system, acid filling the stomach, getting ready for fight or flight. But it's not real. Fear is not real. It's a projection. Now, the moment we put our awareness on what is real, we start to decrease the power that the dream of fear has. But if all we do is put our awareness on the fear, it just ramps up. But if we take our awareness and put it on what is real, and everything is real but what the mind produces, we start to move away from fear and we start to remove its power. And so becoming aware of what is around you, that what is physically around you, the sights, the sounds, the smells, we are putting awareness away from fear and onto what is real. This works to bring us back to reality. Or we can keep our awareness on the fearful thoughts and we get to live as them, because wherever our awareness is, that's what we live as. When we start moving our awareness more into what's real, the sounds, the smells, the sights, we're moving back to reality. We're moving away from this dream. This is the way to deal with fear. There is another methodology that there is another methodology that I use, or used to use. I haven't used it for a long, long time. Whenever I was frightened of something, I allowed the worst to occur, whatever that might be. And so if I was frightened of, I was a diver in my day. I used to love underwater diving. I was out boating every weekend. And we have islands off the west coast of Australia that are full of corals and fish and weed and all sorts of beautiful things to adventure, cave diving, all sorts of things. But out there's a lot of sharks as well. And so I used to dive knowing full well there were sharks. And I was diving the west end of the islands where there were sharks. So I would imagine that it would be okay for the sharks to kill me, to eat me. And in allowing them to kill me, in surrendering my life, fear just dropped away, because fear loses power when you allow what you're frightened to happen. It only has power while you're resisting it. And so before I jump in the water, I'd be okay with being eaten. I'd just give my life up. And in that, fear would drop away because it had been disempowered by my willingness to die, which was the greatest fear, really. And so that was a methodology I used to use as well. But if we find people who are having panic attacks, the best way to bring them out of a panic attack is to have them put their awareness on something that is real, something that's actually happening, something around them, something they can see, something they can hear, and have them keep their awareness there. Then the power of fear disappears. because they've come back to reality. Fear is only a dream, it's not real. I hope that helps, Dr. Rees. And Dr. Rees, who wants to know? Who's asking the question? Who is this? Who are you really?
The following question has been asked by Kelly. When I do other things, I've got to stop focus on the breath. So is it like an on and off practice on the breath? I'm confused on this issue.
It takes, if we're dream-based, which most human adults are, they like to think they're something else based, but most human adults dream their life away, constantly thinking and having awareness on their thoughts. If you want to be a meditator, you start putting your awareness on the breath. That's a pretty good place to start because the breath is real and it brings awareness away from the dream. But it takes a lot of practice because if you're practiced at living in your head and dreaming, well, it's going to take a lot of practice to not do that. And we get to practice by putting our awareness on the breath. As we're sitting silently watching our breath, thought might come in. You deny the thought, come back to the breath. You stay with the breath. You stay with what is real. This is practicing meditation. True meditation is being present to reality all the time. That's true meditation. The practice of meditation is practicing being aware of something that is real so that you can be real instead of be in dream, coming back to reality. But it takes practice. It's not going to happen easily if you're a dreamer. Reclaiming reality from the dream that you found yourself lost in is going to take a lot of practice. But just keep in mind that up until the age of 5, you weren't really that much of a dreamer. You were very present to reality. You were actually in meditation a lot of the time because you were present to what is real, what was around you, what you could hear. It wasn't until you went to school and learnt to live in your head that you lost it all. And so meditation, or the practice of meditation, helps you reclaim reality from the dream that you've been lost in for probably a long time, but only with practice. So you just keep practicing, keep putting your awareness on what is real. Always be with what is real. And you find your whole life changes. Because when you're with what's real, there isn't any problems. Not really. Problems happen in your head. It's just what is. Up to you. You're the only one that can do the practice. Nobody can do it for you. And I won't say it's easy. If you're beginning and you've been a dreamer, it's going to be difficult. But wow, I recommend it. Reality really does rock.
The following question has been asked by Usha. Namaste Vishrant. Instead of putting awareness on something real when there is fear, can we face the fear and bring it very close to us?
We can do. The problem with that is there's a chance the mind's believing the fear and having awareness on the fear, getting lost in it, believing it. And unfortunately, wherever we put the totality of our awareness, we live as. And so if we're angry and we put awareness on anger, we live as anger. If we're sad and we put our awareness on sadness, we live as sadness. If we're fearful and we put our awareness in totality on fear, we live as fear. Now, someone who's awake has awareness locked on awareness. Beingness is aware of itself. And so they live as beingness. They live as pure awareness or consciousness. Wherever our awareness is at, that is where we live. And so I don't really recommend facing the fear. I'm not sure what you mean by facing the fear, but if it means putting awareness on it, I wouldn't go there. Frightened of what? Frightened of sharks. I guess you could say that that's what I did when I jumped in the water with the sharks, the other side of the islands. I was facing my fears. but I wasn't entertaining them. I wasn't going, oh, I'm going to get eaten by a shark here. As a matter of fact, I was just with reality. I'd jump in the water. I'd be with the feeling of the water. I was listening to the bubbles because quite often I dive with tanks. I'd feel myself sinking because I was weighted. I'd be aware of the boat behind me. I'd be aware of the bottom coming up. There's so many things to be aware of. You don't have to be locked on to fear, because the moment we lock on to fear with our totality, we get to live as it. Put your awareness on something else. And fear in itself is okay. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just part of the survival mechanism of the psyche. It's okay that it's there. You always begin with okayness, but you don't need to serve it. You don't need to focus on it. It's just part of the tapestry. There's lots of other things happening.
The next question has been written by a viewer. Where does the practice of self-inquiry take one after the awareness is turned to the one who is watching?
Okay, so Ramana Maharshi, a sage who died in 1950, was asked the question, when do I stop self-inquiring? And his answer was pretty good. He said, when there is no one left to inquire. And I would tend to agree with that. And so self-inquiry is a wonderful tool for turning awareness back to itself. And if awareness is on itself, well, there's no need to self-inquire. There's no need to ask what's aware or who am I? It's over. But if the awareness comes back to the ego, then the question arises again. Who's aware or what's aware of this? And hence turning it back again. And it's a process of continually turning awareness back to itself until awareness locks onto itself like two permanent magnets. And that's, if it stays like that, that's enlightenment. If it locks onto itself and then comes back to ego-based reality, because awareness turns back to the mind solely, that's a satori so there's been an experience of truth as self. That's not enlightenment, that's just a satori. In a lot of ways, it's an invitation to come home. Enlightenment is when that is aware of itself, or that is conscious, becomes conscious of itself, aware of itself, and stays aware of itself. And when that happens, the human being that happens in, a Buddha field is created, a field of energy that can be perceived by those who are sensitive enough to perceive it. And that is the only real way to tell whether someone is awake or they're not awake, whether they have a Buddha field around them, and whether they have a Buddha field around them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Because someone can self-inquire, find awareness on awareness, and temporarily create a Buddha field, but then lose it because they go back to ego-based reality. Someone who's fully awake, awareness is on awareness 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And they don't live as an ego or a body anymore. They live as beingness because their awareness is on beingness. And we really do live wherever awareness is at. So when awareness is on itself, we live as reality. When awareness is on the mind, we live as this dream that thinks it's a somebody, but it's not. Take away your thoughts, and who are you? And all thoughts are imagined. And we are not imagination. We are something. We are pure awareness. We are pure beingness. And so endeavor to discover that by self-inquiring, meditating, practicing openness. The practice of openness removes all the obstacles that are in the way. It's wonderful stuff. And self-inquiry turns awareness back to itself. Witnessing the mind allows you to become the witness, allows you to experience yourself as the witness. These methodologies work, but only if you practice them. Not if you think they're a good idea, only if you practice them.
The next question has been written by a viewer. How does one differentiate between ego and awareness?
The ego is noisy. The ego is always noisy. and awareness is silent and still. And so it's easy to differentiate because awareness doesn't think to start with. That's it's silent, it's still. It's absolutely profoundly silent and profoundly still. The ego can't help itself. It's a noisy piece of equipment. And so differentiation is pretty easy, really. Though the ego can pretend to be beingness, it can pretend to be beingness, but it gets very stale very quick when it's pretending. Beingness itself is always fresh, always in the moment.
In India, enlightened beings have been referred to as being twice born. Can you please explain what this means?
Yeah. So you're born through a mother, and that is your animal birth, if you like, the body birth. Humans don't like to see themselves as animals often, but they are. It's the animal birth, and it's the birth of the spacesuit. And the second birth is when they wake up, because then awareness becomes aware of itself, and that is an awakening, and that is a new birth. But it's not really a birth either, because all that's happening is you're becoming aware of what was always there. It was there before the body was born. And but it is referred to sometimes as a second birth. And so those who have woken up sometimes refer to it as a second birth. For me, finding heart was the best thing. It's like at the age of 34, I found heart, and I considered that was an awakening. That was my birth. Because before that, I felt that I'd wasted a lot of my life because I hadn't had heart. I hadn't had love. Unconditional love is the true jewel of consciousness. And yet, like beingness is always here, but often not perceived because human beings are too closed, too defended, too shut down. If we open right up, our minds open right up, love's here. We can perceive it. It's beautiful. And so, as far as births are concerned, I considered that a second birth. And I feel like I'd wasted 33 years or 34 years of my life beforehand. Another birth is when you take sannyas, if you become a sannyasin to a spiritual master. And I took sannyas with my spiritual master, 𝐬𝐤𝐻-𝐸𝐺, in 1983. And I considered that a birth. And so, being 67 now, I'm actually 34 years old from that birth. Because when you take sannyas, you take on a new name, you leave your past behind, and you take on a spiritual life. And that's very beautiful also. But really, this double birth, wake up and find out. Wake up and find out who you really are. Turn awareness back to itself. Use the mind to turn awareness back to itself. Then all the questions are answered.
The next question comes from a viewer on YouTube. Vishrant, disturbing pictures flash through my mind and I don't know why. How do you heal subconscious wounds?
Yeah, difficult, but possible. It begins with acceptance. So the disturbing pictures flash through your mind. Instead of resisting them, accept them. That doesn't mean entertain them, it means accept them. In acceptance, our resistance to what is changes and our suffering changes. Getting help from people who are further ahead is always a wise decision. For myself, I was very, very fortunate in that I fell into the hands of people who were into higher consciousness when I was 19 years old. And it changed my life immeasurably because these people were further ahead than I was, and they showed me how to get further ahead. As far as healing wounds are concerned, I was pretty wounded because I'd had a rough upbringing. I was carrying a lot of pain body. But I discovered that in allowing myself to feel that rather than avoid it, which I've done most of my life, in allowing myself to feel it, I started to heal it. But there was another step, and that was to not produce any more. A lot of my wounding had been produced by things that had happened in my life, traumatic events, and the belief systems that supported me being a victim inside those traumatic events. And so, in removing victim orientated thinking, in removing those thoughts, I didn't produce any more of the wounding, because that's one of the things that people do. They heal wounding by allowing themselves to feel it, but then they go and reproduce it again by running the same old story in their head and being a victim and just creating the same wounding again. So there's two things that are involved in healing wounds. One is don't recreate it again by being a victim to anything ever, and allow yourself to be tenderly okay with whatever's appearing. If it's pain, you be tenderly okay with it. If it's sadness, whatever it is, you be tenderly okay with it. And everything will empty out. All the pain bodies will empty out if you are willing to feel. We heal by feeling. And that's up to you. No one can do it for you. You have to go on that adventure yourself. Not necessarily by yourself, though. There are people out there that can help you. There are therapists out there that can help you. And these people are worth saying hello to.
A follow-up question from the last, in referring to disturbing pictures flashing through the mind. Is this subconscious wounding or an undisciplined mind?
I think I have not met a human adult yet who's not wounded or who hasn't been wounded. I think we're all wounded and we're all badly programmed. And so when we talk about subconscious and conscious, if we start looking at our programming, we get to see that, wow, we swallowed an awful lot of belief systems that weren't real. We've been brainwashed. And so higher consciousness, in a lot of ways, is reverse engineering the mind's programming and going through it and going, no, 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 not this one, not this one, not this one, because it's rubbish, and letting it all go. Seeing through the mind and also allowing ourselves to feel what's there, rather than using every diversion technique known to man to avoid our pain, allowing ourselves to really feel it, to be with it, to be tenderly okay with it, and then we can heal it. And not producing any more. Stop producing pain. Stop being a victim to life. It's a choice. You actually have to volunteer, because bad things happen, but you have to volunteer to be a victim of them. It's just what is. This attitude works, but you have to do it. No one's going to do it for you. There may be some people who can advise you on the subject, but you basically have to do it. Nobody healed Vishrant's wounds but Vishrant, by allowing whatever was there to be okay, to be tenderly okay, and by not topping the wounding up by being a victim to this, that, and everything else. This is the way. Then it's up to you. I don't know any magic pill that's going to work. You have to feel your wounding to heal it. And you have to stop wounding yourself by running victim-orientated stories about life. Your choice.
The next question has been written by Banu. So, have you been contacted by any astral being?
What makes you think I'm not one? Tune in, see what's here. You won't find anyone here. There's a voice talking, but there's nobody talking.
Next question is from a viewer. How should one deal with competitiveness in the workplace and trying to protect oneself from others when trying to practice openness?
Well, It's easy, be on their side. You see, the moment we're only on our own side in any kind of situation, we've basically gone to war. Competitiveness itself is a form of warfare. Have a look at it. If you really want to play the game sweetly, be on their side as well. Always be on the other side. Always, always, always. It changes the whole gestalt. And so, even if you're in an argument with your partner, be on their side as well as your own. Hold them in tenderness as well as yourself, and you'll find it changes everything. The moment we are only on our own side, we've gone to war. And unfortunately, with war, truth is usually the first casualty. Make yourself available to be on everyone's side and on your own side. This is a beautiful way to live life.
The next question has been written by a viewer. Are we not foiling the consciousness game by getting out of it by attaining enlightenment?
You can't become enlightened unless you've got super consciousness. You're not foiling it. It's the top of the mountain. It's the aim to sit at the top of the mountain and stay there and see everything happening. Higher consciousness is really just the consciousness of everything the mind is doing. Being okay with everything it's doing, seeing everything it's doing, not being ignorant at all, not being caught in it at all. The ultimate and the higher consciousness of the mind is unconditional acceptance of what is, and that leads to super consciousness, which is awareness. That's aware of the mind, becoming aware of itself and staying aware of itself. The ultimate in higher consciousness, super consciousness. So from my perspective, there's lower consciousness, there's higher consciousness, and there's super consciousness. Lower consciousness is the ignorance of dream. Higher consciousness is you're not dreaming anymore. You're just really present and you're aware of what your mind's up to all the time. So you're not lost in anything. And then super consciousness, one step above higher consciousness, knowing self as truth. Awesome. And it's up to you. You can put yourself at any level you want with the way you think and what you do in the world. But if you really want to wake up, self-inquire, meditate, practice openness, hang out with people who are awake. That's a good one.
What happens if you turn your back on truth? Would the call always be there?
Yeah, I did have that experience. I fell out of friendship for a while with my spiritual group with the Rajneesh organization in 1985. I had a disagreement. I turned my back on it for about 6 months, and for that 6 months, the way I avoided the call was I just partied really, and I partied hard, and had a lot of fun, and managed to avoid everything through partying. And then, unfortunately, a friend of mine, I went into a place that I normally go to have to party, and I asked the staff where this man was who I used to party with, and he said, "Well, he's died." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, he's committed suicide." And I went, "Oh my gosh!" And he was such an bubbly character. It's just hard to depict him as someone who would even consider killing himself, but he did. And in that moment, the realization and the recognition again of impermanence, and that we can go beyond the mind, we can wake up here, was so strong that I went and took sannyas again. I went and got my sannyas back and turned my life back to spirituality, because I was way past the point of no return. I knew too much. And when you know too much about higher consciousness, about super consciousness, it's really hard to turn your back on it without you hurting yourself somehow. Being in denial, trying to blind yourself, trying to become ignorant again, it's very difficult and it's painful. Once you start this journey of higher consciousness, you should complete it. You don't want to stop halfway. You keep going. It was relatively difficult to get my sannyas back, but I did, because at that time I had an understanding that 𝐬𝐞𝐥𝐟-𝐢𝐧𝐪 was a doorway to super consciousness, a doorway to enlightenment, and that he was teaching a methodology in a way of the heart that would end up there. And it was like coming back to my love affair with truth, coming back to my love affair with Osho, coming back to my love affair with life itself. I don't think it's good for people who turn their back on truth, especially if they've gone too far. They then live in some form of denial, and I think that ends in bitterness.
Next question is from a viewer. How should one go about looking for awakened people locally? Or do long-distance relationships work?
Local people. You know, I don't think there's that many awakened people. There's someone who's enlightened has a Buddha field. And if they don't have a Buddha field, it doesn't matter what they're saying, they're not enlightened. And as far as Buddha fields are concerned, they're relatively rare. You'll hear about it. Someone who's holding Satsang, you'll hear about it. Someone who's holding that field of energy, you'll hear about it. And you can go along and check for yourself. And if that field of energy is there, then you know you're dealing with someone who's awake. If the field of energy is not there, well, they're not awake. And they're probably a waste of time. Because someone who's not awake can't help you wake up. They can't even wake themselves up. So it's always best to find someone who is awake, and preferably someone who's walking their talk, someone who's actually living what they're teaching. That can be done through Zoom, through video, through online live things. I've found that to be true. This is a relatively new phenomenon, which is pretty cool. Ideally, it's best to be in person with someone if you're looking for a physical master. Be in person with them, because they'll help you wake up. They'll show you the way. They'll show you the obstacles. They'll show you everything that you need to see. And if you're willing, well, that works. If you're not willing, if you want to do it your way, well, that probably won't work. If you're lost in the jungle and you come across a guide who's going to guide you out, you follow the guide. You don't follow, oh, I think it's better to go that way. You follow the guide. Otherwise, you stay lost. But you've got to also make sure that the guide knows the way out. And when it comes to enlightenment, the only guide that knows the way out is someone who's awake. And they have a Buddha field. Sit with them. Watch how your mind goes quiet. Watch how your mind expands. Watch how you find just descending into stillness. The Buddha field is beautiful. It in itself is the Buddha, and it's the doorway to your own true self. Thank you for Satsang. Good to see you brave hearts here today.